Hello, I'm Greg Cootsona, and welcome to On a Crash Course with the Old Testament. In these 10 weeks, you'll get an overview of the story, the overarching narrative of the Old Testament, so that you can find your story in God's story. You are invited to On a Crash Course with the Old Testament. Welcome to On a Crash Course with the Old Testament. We're looking at week 6 today, focusing on the life of David, the great king of Israel. And then actually, right on the heels of that, I'm going to look into what's the material for week 7, which is also on David. So that should be, I think a good continuity of the two. So Israel has a king, and here's the focus of tonight. During a time of peace and prosperity, God builds up ancient Israel through King David. During his reign, and that is around 1000 before the Common Era, as I would say it at Chico State, but here I can just say BC because it's before Christ. David seeks to build up a house for God, which is the temple, which his son Solomon will build. And God also makes a remarkable covenant with David to create a house through the prophet Nathan, an everlasting covenant. And we know that covenant to be fulfilled in the person of Jesus Christ. In this midpoint of our readings, we slow down the pace, which is good because as we're looking at, as I talk, we're going to look at both these in this session, but these 2 weeks are a chance to catch up. So here we go. That was providential. There's a picture you see in there, which is of the area of Beth Shean, and it's a tour of Israel that I was part of. I think it's 12 years now, I believe. And you can see it was this famous space where some of the key battles between the Philistines and the Israelites happened. So let me give a little bit of intro to the people, the person of the king, because I think it's so fascinating. First of all, in the history of Israel, you have two interesting things happening right here. First of all, there is a power vacuum. There's great kingdoms that were part of always threatening Israel from the north, like it was in the Assyrians, would be the Babylonians or whomever else. From the south was always the Egyptians, right? But both of those during the time of David and Solomon were at a relative amount of weakness or lack of strength. So they weren't really threatening Israel. At the same time, what was threatening Israel were the Philistines. So we see this call for a king to centralize the people in order to fight against their great enemy. And again, the reason I did that little picture from, like home movies or whatever, that's what we used to be when I was a kid, is it's a fascinating place. That this is you can see some of the Roman and Greek architecture. I think that's particularly the Roman period that we're standing around. All right, but listen to the difference that Israel had in terms of their kingship from other nations. And this comes from a book called Anthropology of the Old Testament by Hans Wolff, a good German scholar, Hans Walter Wolff. And he talks about something that is different. I've been talking with Bill Jackson in our class about this over the past few weeks. And, were the kings of Israel like the other kings? And Bill said to me, no, I don't think they really were. I think there's some major differences. And so I kept pursuing that. And I think there really are some differences. Listen to this. If you look at a section from Deuteronomy 17, verses 14 through 20, so Deuteronomy 17, 14 through 20, there's this part called the law of the king. So this is in Deuteronomy, it's the second telling of the law. We've studied this in the past weeks. When you come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you've taken possession of it and settled in it, and say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me. If you may indeed set over you a king whom the Lord your God will choose. So remember, and this also came back to me as I was reflecting on this, Israelites were originally slaves. So they always had this consciousness of the king Pharaoh, or the king of Egypt, being someone who oppressed them. So they had a very different approach to what their king would be like. And here's what Wolf says here. In this section, the king is warned to keep his chariots' forces small and not to, quote, cause the people to return to Egypt. That's in verse 16. There was apparently fear that Yahweh, this is God's, right, the name for God, God's deliverance from Egypt might be revoked through political dependence on Egypt. And you see that in Isaiah chapter 30. And even that Israelites might be sent to Egypt to exchange for teams of chariot horses. And you see this in potentially or referenced in 1 Kings chapter 10. So that's the first thing. Not to cause the people to return to Egypt. Second, the king is forbidden to keep a large harem. That's in verse 17a, right? You must not acquire many wives, or he must not acquire many wives for himself, which of course was the standard of the day, polygyny, technically many wives, and yet not to have too many. And we see in Solomon in 1 Kings 11, which we're going to get to next week, how what happens when that goes crazy and you have all these foreign gods that all these foreign wives have. The notion, finally, the king is not to increase the royal treasure, verse 17b. Also, silver and gold he must not acquire in great quantity for himself. According to this, the very things in which the power and prestige of a potentate from that area are founded are not to interest the Israelite king at all. So we're already seeing stripping of the kind of absolute power you might find in other rulers, Babylon, Egypt, even the closer kingdoms of the Ammonites, Jebusites, and so on. Indeed, the king is supposed to study the Torah. You see that in verse 19a. The Torah shall remain with him, the word for the law, the instruction, and the king shall read it all the days of his life, so he may learn to fear the Lord his God. He's to have a second copy of the Torah made for this daily study. The original document remains in the hands of the priests, and it's to guide the king's way of life, verse 19b. If I can find that. He will learn to fear the Lord, diligently observing all the words of this law, meaning this ordinance, this Torah, and these statutes, neither exalting himself about other members of the community nor turning aside from the commandments, either to the right or to the left, so that he, the king, and his descendants may reign long over his kingdom in Israel. And this is a key theme in Deuteronomy. If you obey the law, you will have a prosperous life. So this is very much what happens in this book. The meaning of these instructions only becomes understandable when we remember how the monarchy is viewed in the context of the laws about the administrative powers. So if you go back to Deuteronomy 16 through 18, specifically Deuteronomy 16, verse 18 through 18, verse 22, this is what you might call a coherent draft of a constitution. Typical royal tasks are taken away from the king. The administration of the law is given over to the judges belonging to the group of the priests. The conduct of war is assigned to the militia, together with the priests. The prophets, as Moses' successors, are responsible for the living interpretation of law, or Torah. So all these elements that would have been just aggregated to the king naturally in the area are not given to the king, potentially as a memory that the king that they escaped from did all those things, was the law, had the power of the army, had all this kind of money. Now listen to this. This is where I find this is kind of moving to me. But what then is left over for the king? He is simply to be the model Israelite. This is in Deuteronomy 17, 19b, which we read earlier. The quote, representative, end quote, of the people. He is chosen from among his brothers, and his heart may not be lifted up above them. The real ruler in Israel is God, Yahweh, through his Torah. The priests protect it, the prophets interpret it, and the judges apply it. What is left then for the king? To care for the poor and the needy. I know I've said this before, but I said in a sermon a little while ago because it's such a powerful way of judging our leaders. The leaders were judged by the weakest in the society and how well they were doing. Psalm 72, I think I read it before, is one of the key Psalms. Wolf wonders if maybe this was even read when the king was going up to be enthroned, to be also Mashiach, to be anointed, right, as Messiah. Verses 2 through 4, I'm sorry, 4, verse 4, excuse me. May the king defend the cause of the poor, the people, give deliverance to the children of the needy, and crush the oppressor. Verses 12 through 14. May the king deliver the needy when he calls the poor and him who has no helper. May he take upon himself the cause of the weak and needy and save the lives of them. From the oppression and violence, may he redeem their life. May their blood be precious in his sight. And then I will just mention that Wolf goes on to talk about the famous section of Isaiah called the Servant Songs, which is in Isaiah 50s, 53 to 65, which we get these, key verses that are brought on to the life of Jesus as king. From our salvation, he was chastised, his wounds made us whole. Isaiah 53:4 as one of those. Who could avoid turning from these servant psalms to Philippians 2:5 through 11? Though Christ was in the form of God, he did not count equality with God as something to be grasped or exploited, but he emptied himself, taking the form of a servant and going all the way to death on a cross, right? Here, the explicit and implicit criticism. This is an interesting way of putting it, that there's actually a criticism of monarchy in the Old Testament. Here in Philippians, this criticism reaches its unsurpassable peak. So remember how we looked at this with verse, it was chapter 8, right, of 1 Samuel, when the people asked for the king and God is not so happy with it. He's going to enslave you. He's going to make you work really hard. He's going to have all kinds of money. He's going to tax you. He's going to have all kinds of chariots. So there's always this criticism, internal criticism of the power, of the absolute power of the king. And I just found that really powerful. And as we look at the arc of David's life, the first week, as it were, is about David on the ascent, right? Things are going really well with David. And we really see why, we see why also when things don't go so well, but we see why this is the person after God's own heart. But then we also see the downside and in the readings from the second week. So let me just highlight those right now. So in 2 Samuel 1 through 2 and 5 through 6, you have what many think of as some of the most vivid court history, as you might say, like what happened actually in the life and the people of Israel, of any of perhaps any document. So we could turn, and as I said, I'm just going to highlight these, and we can take some more time with them later. 2 Samuel chapter 1. Always good to have your book marked when you're talking about it. But oh well, just proving that, I guess. So Saul's death is reported, and you see David, really enforcing this, greatness of the king, and the sense of why we have to respect the office of the king, even if Saul wasn't always good to David. Right. And then David laments over the death of both Saul and then Samuel, who David says, your love to me, 2 Samuel chapter 1, verse 26. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan, Greatly beloved were you to me. Your love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. And then, there's ongoing battles. As I mentioned, we skipped a couple chapters, but various key conflicts, especially with the Philistines. And then in chapter 5, David is anointed king of Israel. Let's go to chapter 5, verse 1. Then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, look, we are your bone and flesh. For some time while Saul was king over us, it was you who led out Israel and brought it in. The Lord said to you, it is you who shall be shepherd. Back to this reading we did earlier from Psalm 23. Shepherd over my people Israel. you shall be ruler over Israel. So all the elders of Israel came to the king in Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them in Hebron before the Lord. And they anointed, again, Messiah. They made a Messiah. Anointing is the word we take. Anyway, Messiah means to anoint. They anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned for 40 years. And then David does a really strategic move. We see a lot in David. We see apparently very handsome man, great warrior, good musician. I mean, God, goodness gracious, what doesn't this guy have going for him? But he's also wise, or he shows wisdom politically. He moves the capital to a common spot for both the northern and southern tribes. I'm going to show you this on a map. So see the map on the left. Jerusalem is right here, right? So it's the top of the tribes of Judah and Edom, the two tribes of the south, but it's the bottom, you might say, of the 10 tribes to the north. So there's a wisdom about what David's doing. You know, he's bringing, kind of like Washington, D.C. in the day was between the north and the south, right? That's the same kind of idea. They moved, our forefathers moved our government from New York City and then Philadelphia or whatever, Philadelphia, New York City, and then to Washington, D.C. My point is really David, and he was moving the capital to be to a more neutral location. So there's a wisdom there. Of course, he has to win win that capital for Israel, which he does. And then they bring the ark, right? The ark, which had the tablets of the law, the 10 Commandments. They brought it, and David was so excited that I don't know how you interpret this. I interpreted that he was an emotionally exuberant person, and he just dances in an ephod, which, as I understand it, is like a nightshirt. It might also be a more priestly or liturgical gown, but that's the language we'd use. But anyway, he dances, and we can discuss what we think of that. But his wife does not think it's such a great idea and says, "You're not acting like a king." You know what I mean? That's what a king should do. But he's so excited that the ark is coming to Jerusalem that he dances, and might be drunk on wine, as we're hearing. It's that we could hold that out as a possibility for sure. And then I think the most important, that's all those three passages are important. Like we don't want to miss what's happening. We got the capital coming to Jerusalem. We've got the ark coming to Jerusalem. We've got now this covenant with David. Berit olam, everlasting covenant. Berit is covenant, olam is everlasting. When we were being immature in seminary, we call it burrito olam, but it's really Berit olam. Yeah, exactly. Burrito olam. You can remember burrito olam, right? And there's this play on words that David, that God through Nathan and David make about the house. So basically, God's going to make David an ongoing house, a lineage, right? And then David, but God's like, I'd like a house too, essentially. I want a house. In other words, I want a temple. I want there to be a place where the glory, the Shekinah is the word that's used in Hebrew, the glory, the presence can dwell forever. And that's where, by the way, today, because the Ark of the Covenant was brought to where the Holy of Holies was in the temple, the retaining wall, the western wall, the Wailing Wall is the closest place to where that Ark was. And that's why Jews still today pray there, because they feel that is this place where God's glory still dwells to this day. I guess I'll just summarize it just in view of time, but that's a really important section, this covenant that God makes with David, and how does it point? This is something we could talk about. How does it point to the covenant through David's son Jesus, right? Through David's lineage and house, Jesus. So here, and then this overall reflection, I want to just stop because we're at a really good point here, right? This is a really good part of David's life. Things are really going well here. What does David teach us about leadership? How can you lead others toward what God's heart is by learning from his example, both the good and the bad? So I want to just go back to the monarchy for a second. I think my next slides are going to be in the next week's material, right? Okay, so just so you see where we're going while we're looking at the map, if you look at the map on the right, you can see what happens after the death of Solomon, where there's always this tension between North and South in Israel. And the northern kingdom is called Israel, the southern is called Judah. And there is a division that happens after the death of Solomon. There's really only a unified kingdom under Saul, Solomon, and David. Sorry, Saul, David, and Solomon. After that, there's a separate king set up in the kingdom of Judah. Of Israel, the northern kingdom, from the kingdom of Judah. So it's a little bit of what my mom used to call the avertissement, the foreshadowing of week 7.